Okay, now we're going to take a look at Paul of Tarsus and break this up into two parts, but first of all, talk a little bit about him. The chapter immediately begins to describe and contrast Peter and Paul. Peter, of course, is the most prominent of the apostles in the Gospels, and then Paul is the most prominent among the leaders in the early church, sort of following on the heels of Peter. In the book of Acts, Paul's conversion occurs and the story is told three times. It actually serves as kind of the cornerstone of the book of Acts. In the book of Galatians, he describes his Damascus Road experience and talks about what an impact that had made in his own life going forward. Peter also tells us something about Paul. In 2 Peter 3:15, we're told about Paul, the letter writer, Paul who is misunderstood. But Peter acknowledges Paul as one of his, compatriots who work with him in the mission of the early church. Saul of Tarsus. Let's talk a little bit about him, his name, and what all that represents. The old story is that on the road to Damascus, his name was changed from Saul to Paul, but we'll learn that isn't actually the case. Saul of Tarsus was a Jew by birth and also a Roman citizen by birth. He was born in the free city of Tarsus, the capital of Cilicia. Just a moment, I'll show you a picture of that. Most Romans had three names. We have a first name, a middle name, and a last name. Well, they had what's called the pronomen, nomen, and cognomen. Now, the cognomen is sort of like the last name or surname. And when it comes to Paul, that name was not his first name. It was his last name, if you will. It was his surname. And it meant he belonged to the Pauli family. Saul was actually probably not a name. It was probably a supernum or a nickname. In other words, Paul never had an experience on the Damascus Road that had a name change. He wasn't known as Saul the Jew and then became Paul the, apostle to the Gentiles. Paul was always his name, his family name, and we actually are not given the other names that he would have had. Here is a map of the world of Paul in his day, and you can see here the kind of trip that you could have taken along these ancient roads. You can see here the major road system called the Cilician Road and how it cut across Asia and all the way down into Tarsus where Paul was born. These are those mountains, those famous mountains and mountain range near where Paul lived. Now we know from the Bible and from history that Tarsus was, quote, no ordinary city. It stood on the Cilician Road. And one of the things that we learn from the early writers is that this was a very learned city. Education was extraordinarily valued among the people. One of the things that were said about people is they learned and then they would travel abroad. That it had become sort of like the new Athens or the new Alexandria. It was a place of high education and learning, and it was known for its rhetoric. The idea of Greek rhetoric or rhetorical style was a style of careful argument in terms of persuasive speech and writing, and that comes across in Paul's letters. Paul, we know, studied in Jerusalem under Gamaliel, so apparently after he completed his ordinary education there in Tarsus, traveled abroad as was the custom, and studied in Jerusalem under the very famous rabbinic teacher Gamaliel. This also shows us that Paul of Tarsus would have come in contact with Greek literature and Greek writings. In Tarsus, he would have learned some of the great Greek poets and the Greek philosophers. And in fact, we see him even quoting from some of the pagan Greek poets in some of his speeches that are given in the book of Acts. And it's a question we're thinking about. How do you feel about that? There are a lot of people in our world today who would say Christians should completely separate themselves from the world. But here you have a Paul who not only knew the culture of his world, but would actually use what he knew about his world and its culture to then create a bridge through which he could communicate the gospel. And I think we have here a very important concept in Paul's writing about how we should do missionary work in our world today. Philippians 3:5 and following, that chapter, and that third chapter in Philippians, tells us about Paul, tells us about how he was a Hebrew of Hebrews, and how in regard to the law he was considered faultless, and how he's from the tribe of Benjamin, and goes through a long explanation of how he was circumcised on the 8th day, how he had perfectly lived out the Jewish requirements of a Jewish person, that all the boxes had been checked on his Judaism. Now there's an open question about Paul, and that is, what happened to his spouse? And the reason that question is asked is because a typical Jew, particularly a rabbi, would get married and they would have children. And so it sort of raises this question: did Paul get married and then get a divorce? Did Paul get married and his wife left him? Did Paul get married and his wife died? So we don't really know. Did Paul get married and his wife just stayed at home, or went back to Tarsus, or stayed in Jerusalem? And so there's sort of this question in the Gospels, in the New Testament, about who or about Paul's spouse. This is a picture from the book. You'll recall a road, this Damascus road. This is a picture that was actually taken closer in near Petra, but it gives you a sense of what that road would have been like, where Paul would have encountered Jesus. It's on this Damascus road that Paul the persecutor, will undergo a kind of conversion. That may not be the right word for it, because conversion is sometimes used of a person going from one religion to another. What Paul actually did was he witnessed the risen Jesus and realized that Jesus was the Messiah of Israel. He was the fulfillment of his own scriptures, and it's less of a conversion and more of a discovery about who Jesus really is. Now, the first time that we actually hear about Paul in the Bible is in the book of Acts, when Stephen is martyred, and then we're told that Saul was overseeing it. One of the things that we know about Saul is that before he became a believer in Jesus, he was a persecutor of the people who believed in Jesus. And that Damascus Road experience he would describe as Christ grabbing hold of him. In Acts, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, 1 Corinthians 15, he'd tell us that he had seen the risen Jesus. In Galatians 1, he tells the story about his own conversion. It's an interesting question to think about. How would Jews who valued their own tradition, how would they have seen Paul's conversion? And that's in quotation marks, because I'm not sure that's the right word to use for it. But how would the other Jews who Paul had already been working with to persecute Christians have thought about his own conversion? And the answer is, they would have really had a hard time with it. They would have been shocked by it. They would have been dismayed by it. It would have seemed really unusual to them. And it's a part of perhaps the reason God chose to use Paul in such an extraordinary way, was precisely because of the kind of testimony that he would have. He would become the herald of the gospel. He would proclaim that Jesus was Messiah after his conversion. On the road to Damascus, he would go into Damascus, he would do that. And he would refer to himself as an apostle, one who was sent out. Apostolos is the one who is sent out in Greek. There's a related concept in Hebrew called the shaliach, which is this idea of one who goes out as a representative of another and bears the authority of the one that they represent. And this is part of the idea here. Paul is an ambassador. He's not just simply going out to tell people about Jesus. He is going out as God's representative to tell people about who Jesus is. Here he describes his own responsibility in this light. He says, "But when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb, called me," and then he begins to say what happened. "I went into Arabia, and later I returned to Damascus. Then after 3 years I went to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Peter or Cephas, and stayed with him 15 days." He begins to describe his calling as not just one who was called by his birth, but one who was called out through this Damascus Road experience to then go as a representative to tell other people about what it was that God wanted them to do. This is one of the places that he went to. This was a city in the Nabatean kingdom called Petra. We know that he went into Arabia, which was Nabatea. This is a picture of the Nabatean King Aretas, who it is mentioned in the New Testament that Paul they had gotten upset with him and had an encounter with. We're told he returned to Damascus, stayed 3 years, but then left the city by night and went to Jerusalem. When he gets to Jerusalem, the believers were afraid of him. They didn't believe, he was for real. Can you imagine? Last time they saw him, he was their persecutor, and now he was an apostle. But Barnabas accepts him and presents him to the disciples, and together they conduct a ministry toward the Greek Jews or Hellenistic Jews. In the book of Galatians, Paul tells us that he insisted on his own gospel's independence, and that he had only met with Peter and James. And so one of the things that's kind of complicated here is that in Galatians, Paul is always affirming that his gospel is independent. But in Acts, we're seeing that Paul would work somewhat together with some of the other disciples of Jesus or apostles. Acts seems to emphasize his acceptance. Paul himself wants to emphasize his independence. But we see that Paul also had become a lightning rod, and before long he would have to leave, and he would go to Caesarea Maritima, and then he would go to Syria, and then he would go to Tarsus, Cilicia, his home. But then would come a new mission of Paul, that he would be called to go to the Gentiles. He would leave, Caesarea. Well, he'd leave Syria and Antioch. The church would send him out, and he would go and start churches and do ministry all over the world. Acts recounts those 3 missionary experiences. At the end of those, he would be imprisoned in Caesarea. This is a picture of a horse track that is still visible today in Caesarea Maritima. This was the area in which Paul was imprisoned for a number of years after his 3 missionary journeys.